And back up to that. Okay. Engagement and motivation to learn, building mental health support, financial literacy, responsibility, curiosity, engagement and learning, problem solving, communication and teamwork. These are a lot of things that are echoed in many of the models of 21st century skills that we'll be talking a little bit about in just a couple of minutes. All right, if someone does not have audio, but expect, I think, support at big.com, and they should be able to help with whatever problems you are encountering if you are unable to have, if you don't have audio. If you're using Chrome, you should be in good shape. That is the optimum browser to be able to hear the audio and see everything as clearly as possible. All right, we're at 2:29, so we're just going to give it another minute for others to join us. Time management, life coping skills, handling the pressures and expectations on today's student, and they are enormous. They are very, very intense. We expect an awful lot of our students today. And in many respects, we expect them to behave like adults long before they have the development and the skills necessarily to do it. But of course, we can support that. So a few more people are joining us. And we are at about, we're right at 2:30. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Want to say good afternoon again. This is Betsy Hill. I'm president of the BrainWare company. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, which is hosted by the Brains and Learning channel. As we're getting started, what we're doing is everybody's sharing some of their ideas about some of the most important of the 21st century skills. So feel free to enter that information in the chat window if you haven't already shared your thoughts. And while you're doing that, just a couple of housekeeping items. First of all, we are recording today's webinar. A link to the archived version will be available within a day or so. Also, we will be providing a copy of the slides to those who are attending today, as long as you provided your contact information when you registered and logged in. We will automatically be sending that to you. If you're watching this as a recording, you can contact us to request a copy of the slides, and that information will be included at the very end of the webinar. Finally, please let us know if you would like to receive a certificate of participation for today. You can type that request and also any questions you have along the way into the chat window. Comments are also welcome. You can also send me an email, today or later in order to do that. So Karen, you've also been, my colleague Karen Bucola is also monitoring the chat window for questions. Karen, are there some other skills that people have mentioned that particularly struck you? Okay, good. Well, I'm going to let you continue on with that. Some of these topics, I think decision-making, particularly I teach strategic thinking in an MBA program, and we actually spend an entire session, 3.5 hours, on decision-making. So some of these could be the topic for webinars all unto themselves, but we're going to go ahead and proceed now. So one of the challenges of this topic, of course, is that there are so many different ideas that people have about what constitutes a 21st century skill. And as I compared various lists and models, in fact, the less clear it became. There are just so many ideas. One thing that helped that I thought was pretty interesting was a kind of a catalog of skills identified as 21st century skills in various resources. And here's a part of the chart. I will also send a link or a copy of this chart and the article it appears in to those who are participating today. And my intention is not for you to necessarily see all of it, but what this does, it's referred to as a crosswalk. And what it does is it compares several lists of 21st century skills. The Partnership for 21st Century Skills, the 7 Survival Skills, which I think is Iowa Essential Concepts and Skills, the Connecticut Department of, so various different sources. And then there's a check mark in the column where the list includes that skill. So there's a lot of agreement on skills like collaboration, critical thinking, and problem solving, but certainly those are some of the ones that you all reflected as on the top of your mind. And there are other skills like visualization, for example, environmental literacy, metacognition, that just appear on a single list. If you do which I always find to be sort of entertaining, do a Wordle of an article on 21st century skills, it may also not help very much, although it does reinforce to me why we care about it. It's about employers and workers. It's about jobs and careers. It is our recognition that we really don't know today what the jobs of the future will be. Estimates are that 65% of children in elementary school today will have jobs that don't yet exist. And so obviously we're preparing them and trying to figure out what those important skills are. So as I considered the skills on the various lists, I observed that there were very different types of skills. Some dealt with knowledge, like financial or environmental literacy. Others were about fundamental mental processes, like visualization. And still others were sort of complex mental processes, like problem solving. And what I needed a conceptual framework to make sense of them, and so I'm going to share with you what I came up with. At the very top, I think it's always helpful to have our ultimate goals in mind. We don't really know what the future will look like in terms of academic requirements or the kinds of jobs or what new research on health and well-being will uncover. But our students will need the 21st century skills to achieve those. And we, of course, are trying to prepare them for that. Among the list of 21st century skills are a group that I sort of categorize right underneath this because they are really domain knowledge. They're knowledge of facts, issues, circumstances of our lives that we hope our students will learn about. Things like financial literacy, entrepreneurship, global awareness, environmental literacy. So these are disciplines or domains where we want our students to have familiarity, knowledge, and comfort. I can imagine other skills being added to these content areas, but this captures a lot of what has appeared on many of the lists. Of course, our traditional forms of models of literacy need to be captured here as well. Reading and writing, math, technology. Some people put technology up in more of a 21st century skill, but frankly, I don't think you can get through most days today without being pretty familiar with technology. And certainly our students are proving themselves to be digital natives as they grow up with technology. So this is a good part to me of the what. This is what we want students to understand, the knowledge that they will need. But what about the more general skills? What about the thinking skills that are embodied in and called 21st century skills? Well, there's a group that we can sort of assemble together here, which are often referred to as higher order executive functions. And the terminology executive function is being used a lot to refer to the directive capacities of our mind. So when we apply ourselves and think about things and order information in our minds and all those kinds of things. And these higher order executive functions are a lot of what's being talked about when we're not talking about the content, domain kind of information. These are complex, multifaceted skills that enable us to manage and manipulate information and the behaviors that we engage in alone and with each other. So here we find reasoning, problem-solving, planning, critical thinking, collaboration, creativity. These are skills that appear, as we said, on many, many of those lists. It's also the case that these skills build on a group of what are a little bit more fundamental executive functions. We refer to these as core executive functions. And we don't often talk about these in the same breath as we talk about some of those other 21st century skills, simply because I think they aren't as well understood and they are so much more basic, the kinds of things that we aren't even aware that we're doing when we're doing them. The term executive functions is being used a lot more in education these days. Teachers often think of these skills as being self-regulation, and indeed there are certainly aspects of self-regulation in these, but there's also quite a bit more to it. So the three core executive functions, and these are absolutely essential for higher order executive functions, so we need to understand a little bit about these core ones. Working memory refers to our ability to hold information in our minds while we manipulate it. So we can't reason, we can't problem solve, for example, unless we have adequate working memory. Inhibitory control refers to pretty much what it sounds like. It's when we can stop ourselves from doing something we otherwise would do, but it also represents the ability to defer gratification for a period and over time. That's necessary for planning. It's also necessary, inhibitory control, in working together with a group, collaboration. And then cognitive flexibility refers to our ability to shift our mindset when things around us in the world change. These are very necessary, shifting our mindset for critical thinking, also for creativity. And then there's, of course, you can see that there's room still at the bottom of this slide, because what we need to understand finally is that there is another layer of skills that perhaps neither traditional education nor 21st century skills necessarily address, and that's these foundational cognitive skills. These are basic mental processes, some of the most basic things that our brains engage in, like attention or various aspects of visual processing, sequential processing, auditory processing. One of the skills that I mentioned earlier that I found on one of the lists of 21st century skills, visualization, is actually a pretty foundational cognitive skill, which is the ability of us to use our vision system to create images and to be able to see, in quotes, things that aren't in front of us when we're thinking about them. And some of you may be wondering why this chart has all of these cognitive processes, the foundational skills and the executive functions, underneath what we typically think of as basic from an academic point of view, reading and writing and technology. And that's because our academic skills are in fact dependent on our foundational cognitive skills and our executive functions. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes exploring this a little bit. So if I ask teachers today what the basics of reading are, I typically get something like decoding and fluency and comprehension. And that's great. Those are indeed skills we need to have to be good readers. But they're also not necessarily the most basic, because there is, in fact, no decoding part of our brain. There's no fluency part of our brain. In order to decode or be fluent or comprehend, there are a number of different mental processes that need to be working together at the same time for us to do that. Likewise, decoding, we have to sustain our attention, visual discrimination, keeping the letters and words in the right order. Fluency requires visual span and processing speed as well as others. And let's think for just a moment about the so-called basic reading process called comprehension, which is not necessarily basic at all, although our brains are constantly seeking order and meaning and to comprehend. But there's some mental processes we need to be able to do that. So when I hold information I'm reading about in my mind, and I add more information, more pieces of information in as I read along, that happens in working memory. When I try to see a picture in my mind of what I'm reading, that also demands visualization skills. And let's just take an example. So this is one of my favorite childhood books that starts this way. If you want to find Cherry Tree Lane, all you have to do is ask the policeman at the crossroads. He will push his helmet slightly to one side, scratch his head thoughtfully, and then he will point his huge white-gloved finger and say, first to your right, second to your left, sharp right again, and you're there. Good morning. So your ability to visualize this scene and to hold the directions in your mind, later deciding whether to turn right or left at the first cross street, is dependent on your ability to visualize and the capacity of your working memory. Your ability to compare this to what you know about from the world and to make sense of it requires that real estate space, if you will, in working memory to be able to consider it and to comprehend it. The same kinds of simple principles apply in math. Those same skills and others are what allows us to understand and deal with spatial representations, manipulating information. I used to refer to this as story problems because when I learned math, that's what they were called, which distinguished them from just solving equations. But today in math, of course, everything is a story problem. It's all about application to real life. And those same skills allow us also then, and others, to reason logically and to solve problems because ultimately math is very logical. So imagine what it would be like if you had to solve a problem like this one, if you could only hold 2 or 3 pieces of information in your mind at one time. Here we have Samantha going to the grocery store, and she has a list, and we have prices that are different for each of the lists, and she basically has to add them up. Her gas also costs a certain amount. She has a coupon off. There's a lot of information here, and trying to sort it out, getting into an order that makes sense, and to be able to compare them at the end is something that is not just about doing addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. It's about understanding the relationships among the pieces of information, processing them, rearranging them into the necessary sequence, and then comparing the result. Now, if any of you have actually read the problem, and some of you I know just can't stand not to know what the answer is, so the answer is her best bet is the good food store. And of course, you'll get these in the slides and you can work that out for yourself. Oops, let's go back one more. All right. So back to our slide that shows the hierarchy of skills. And there are just a couple more important points to make. First of all, educators, we are taught to teach reading and math and technology and all the other subject matter that sits on top of those. We aren't taught to teach cognitive skills and executive functions. Why is that? Well, the answer, I think, is that by and large, our foundational cognitive skills and core executive functions happen at a non-conscious level. That is, we aren't aware of them. Since you've been participating in this webinar, I doubt whether you have thought about your breathing once. Nor have you probably thought about visual span or auditory discrimination. You may have wished for more working memory capacity to hold on to some information in your mind, but there wasn't much that you could do about it at the time. So a teacher can't explain to someone how to visualize or hold information in their mind or shift their attention more quickly. So these skills aren't amenable to the kind of instruction that teachers are trained to do. But that doesn't mean that they can't be developed, and that's what we're going to look at next. Since we need for our students to have strong foundational cognitive skills and core executive functions to be able to engage fully in higher order executive functions, we're going to look at those first, and then we're going to look at the higher order executive functions after that. So first we're going to talk about the ability to develop cognitive skills and executive functions and what the academic impact of that might be. I'm going to share with you a program that was implemented in a school. This did not take place in a clinic or a lab or a special school. It was a program that was implemented by regular teachers and aides, in some cases, in an after-school program in a high-poverty urban school in Indiana. For this pilot program, the principal decided to choose 30 third through fifth graders, and he chose them based on, he knew the families and expected that the students would actually be able to attend the program regularly. We're going to look at a different group in a few minutes. The program included 10 weeks of cognitive training with a computer program called BrainWare Safari. And if you're interested later in learning more about that program, we'd be happy to provide some information. But basically, what it does is it trains comprehensively those foundational cognitive skills and executive functions that you saw on that pyramid. The students averaged 3 sessions a week, working for about 45 minutes to an hour, and they took a test called the COGAT, the Cognitive Assessment Test, in order to be able to measure the changes in their cognitive skills. Now, some educators are familiar with this, at least as I've spoken with a number of people over time, and some aren't. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a glimpse. There are 3 subtests. The first subtest of the COGAT is a verbal subtest, and it contains 3 types of verbal problems, challenges. Classification, we have to classify words in certain ways. Green, blue, and red are all colors, and another color is yellow. Sentence completion, so we have to be able to understand the meaning of words, and then verbal analogies. Many of you have seen tests like this, I'm sure, in the past or taken them yourselves. The quantitative section deals, of course, with numbers, numerical items, and there are 3 areas again here. One is comparing 2 different quantitative expressions, so we need to know that 0 plus 3 is the same as 3 plus 0, that we can pick out numbers in a series so that we know we're counting by some kind of multiple, and the last one is just solving an equation. And then the third category, the third subsection of the COGAT is the nonverbal, and this involves classification of figures where we have to figure out what they have in common, analogies, which are similar to the verbal analogies, but they're, of course, nonverbal. They're abstract figures. And then the last one is figure analysis, which really requires us to have spatial understanding and be able to manipulate that information in our minds. Remember, again, we do that in working memory. We use our visualization skills. We all use all of those cognitive processes, and they're essential for that. So on the COGAT, the results of the 3 tests are then combined into an overall composite score. Each individual score is compared to national norms, and what you get out of it is an age percentile ranking. So if you're at the 70th percentile, you're scoring better than 70% of the population. If you're at the 30th, you're in the lower portion and scoring only better than about 30% of the population. So what we're going to look at here is the change in cognitive, the results of the pre-test and the post-test for that group of students who use BrainWare Safari in the after-school program. And as you can see, the students improve their overall cognitive ability as measured by the COGAT by an average of 12 percentile points. That's the overall composite. But pretty much across the board, it had an impact on verbal, quantitative, nonverbal. Even though it is not a program that expressly teaches reading or teaches math or teaches any other subject matter, it simply develops those cognitive processes in the mind, which are then there, as we talked about, because there's essential components. The COGAT is predictive of academic performance, and students who score at the 70th percentile or higher will very likely be successful academically. If you're scoring below the 30th or 40th percentile, you're going to have some real struggles. In between, students can learn but often need some adjustment of the instruction or the curriculum. So what we're going to look at now is another view of that group of students. We're looking at them in percentile ranges. So we're looking at the percentage of the students who scored in each of the percentile ranges. And as you can see, what happened here is that the number of students, or the percentage of students actually, performing at that magic 70th percentile and above went from 30% on the pretest to almost 2/3 of the group scoring in that range, which we could consider to have a high probability of doing very well in school without adjustment of the instruction or the curriculum. The percentage of the students scoring in that lowest percentile range has also decreased substantially. So that means that we have now fewer students who are going to have significant modifications in order to make acceptable academic progress. Now we're going to look at another group. 2 years later, same school district. This time the students were selected because they were performing in the red range. There's a green range, a yellow range, and a red range on this particular reading assessment that they were screened with. And the red range meant that they were way below standard in the standard level in reading. These are 3rd, 4th, and 5th graders who are very poor readers, or some of them probably not reading much at all. Some of these students then did their cognitive training in a before-school program. Some of them did it in an after-school program. But otherwise, the plan was similar to that first pilot. So I want to ask you to think for a minute, use your visualization skills to think about, and your critical thinking skills, to think about how these students might compare to the first group of students on their cognitive test scores. What might you guess? Well, got to get to the right slide. If you guessed that their pretest scores would be lower overall, you would be right. If you guessed that the second group would have significantly lower scores on the verbal section of the COGAT, you would also be right, that being the section that corresponds most directly to their very low reading performance. These students scored in the verbal pretest an average of the 38th percentile. These students would require, in any kind of schooling situation, major support and adjustments to curriculum instruction to be able to learn to read, at least based on their pretest scores. The cognitive skills are not fixed. They can be developed, as we saw before and as we've seen in much other research. These students gained an average of 13 percentile points, very similar to the 12 percentile points for the first group. And I can also share with you very similar, this has been repeated in a variety of different populations all over the country in different kinds of situations. And the gains are quite remarkably consistent over all those experiences. So these students went from an average of the 38th percentile in their, of the 35th percentile, I think I said that incorrectly, the 35th actually on the pretest, to the 48th. So this is a dramatic change in their verbal cognitive abilities and overall increase in their cognitive capacity. So the outlook for these students being able to learn to read and to benefit from the kind of reading instruction that is available to them in their classrooms and possibly also in their after-school programs is much, much greater. Now we can also look at this group from that perspective that we took before, looking at how many we have in that 70th percentile. You can see basically there was only a single student who was scoring at the 70th percentile and above within this group on the pretest. And afterwards, after their cognitive training program, fully a third were. The numbers in those lower categories have shifted down. So we've managed to move quite a number of students into the range where we can now confidently predict their academic success and where most students can learn within a typical instructional environment. So we're going to come back to our skills slide. We've just been talking about the ability to develop foundational cognitive skills and those core executive functions. What about those higher order executive functions, which represent the next level up in our model of 21st century skills? It looks like there's quite a lot going on in the chat window. I'm going to have to stop in a minute and see if there's some questions that we can answer along the way. Karen, if there's something for clarification or something isn't clear, I'm going to ask you to interrupt me and just let me know about those questions. So what we're going to do is now think a little bit more about those higher order, the ones that we classically, I think about as those 21st century skills: reasoning, problem solving, planning, critical thinking, collaboration, creativity. Here, I cannot tell you, unfortunately, that there's a computer program that can develop them, at least in a comprehensive manner. But what I can and want to suggest is that there are some ways to think about these skills, and I would also suggest some examples of some types of activities, some specific exercises or activities that I and others have used that you should feel free to use, adapt as you see fit. So that's what we're going to focus on for the next little bit. As we do this, it may be helpful to remind ourselves of a little bit of neuroscience, because what we're really doing here, both in the foundational cognitive skills training and in what we're going to be talking about, is we're changing our students' brains. We're helping those brains develop and change, and let's just take a look for a minute about what exactly that means. So our brains are made up of neurons, the basic cells that communicate in the brain. And the communication among these neurons is the basis of all human behavior and all of our thinking. And in fact, these connections among the neurons are how we learn. Our neurons communicate with each other by sending an electrical signal down the axon. So that you can see in this diagram. There are 3 neuron cells bodies with the little black dot as the nucleus, and the signal travels down and is retrieved by a dendrite, that's the receptor, of another neuron. And you can see on this diagram that the axon of the neuron on the left is covered in something that's labeled as a myelin sheath. It actually is not as clear here as I would like. But basically, this is the axon, and these little sausage link type shapes actually represent the myelin sheath. Myelin sheath basically myelin is a fatty substance that helps the electrical signal travel faster and more efficiently down the axon. Why is all this important? Okay, we're going to see. What learning is the act of making and strengthening connections between thousands of neurons that form into neural networks or maps. So when we teach, we are helping our students form those neural networks in their brains. What we do physically changes brains. The brain is a learning machine. It builds itself through experience to create and strengthen the connections among the neurons that are the most useful and used the most. So when we help our students use those connections over and over again, we're reinforcing them, and we make sure that they stay strong and work well. When we remember something, what we're really doing is not pulling it out of some storage. We're actually reactivating, we're reconstructing by reactivating previously made connections. And as certain neural networks are used more and more, they become stronger and faster and more likely to activate. And part of that is related to the myelin sheath that develops on the axons over time and with maturation. There's some other reasons for it as well, but basically, as those connections become strong, the neuroscientists like to say that neurons that fire together wire together, and that is in fact learning. That's what learning is all about. The development of the brain actually happens from the back to the front. So the back is our visual system. The front is the system actually that is responsible for a lot of those 21st century skills that we're going to be talking about. The blue areas of the brain here are more myelinated, and therefore mature and faster and more efficient than the red and yellow areas. This is age 5, this is age 20. And so our brains, of course, are not actually blue and red and yellow, but the brain scans use these colors to highlight the differences and make them easier to see. The front part of the brain is the very last to develop, taking well into our 20s. So why is that important? It's important because the front part of the brain is where our reasoning, problem solving, and critical thinking, etc., happen. So when we work with children and adolescents, we are working with incompletely developed brains. That doesn't mean they can't reason or think critically or problem solve. It just means that they won't be as fast and efficient as they will be later. But they can get better at these skills, and it takes practice. The neural networks that carry out those activities need to fire together repeatedly to wire together and make those patterns of thinking more automatic. As I said, there's no computer program that I know of today that will develop these skills in any comprehensive way, although theoretically it's very possible. But practicing them, frankly, can be a lot of fun and very rewarding nonetheless. So I'm going to start with reasoning. When we talk about reasoning, and for those of you who took philosophy and logic and reasoning classes, of course we're going to simplify some here, but basically when we talk about reasoning, we're usually talking about 2 types of logical thinking. And when you sort of point these out to children, I find that they're pretty fascinated. Children from 7 on up can really appreciate how we think about things and how we reason. Deductive reasoning goes from the general to the specific. So if all of the 5th grade students are on the playground and Mary is a 5th grade student, that by definition we know that Mary is on the playground. The other kind is inductive reasoning, and it works the other way. What I do is I take instances of things that I see and I generalize from those. All the dogs I have seen bark, and therefore all dogs bark. Of course, that's how we build mental models. Mental models are useful ways of simplifying the world, but they may not be true for every instance. I have, in fact, met dogs that don't bark, but they're still dogs. As I said, children are often fascinated by the conclusions we can reach through different types of reasoning. One activity that you could do is create a list on a wall of examples that they come up with and encourage them to find exceptions to the conclusions of inductive reasoning. They will enjoy proving that something isn't always true. Well, just the same way they love proving that we're not always right. Here's an exercise, a critical thinking exercise that I've used with students of all ages, pretty much, including adults, to give them practice of thinking critically. I do this with an actual box, so I'm doing it sort of virtually today with a picture on a slide. You don't have to have it gift wrapped, by the way. You can use any old kind of box you want. And the student's job is to think about, discuss, figure out what might be in the box just by observing, discussing, and thinking about it. They may not be able to figure out exactly what it is, but they can determine a lot just with careful thinking. We can draw conclusions about the size, so we can exclude a lot of things. There isn't an elephant in the box. There isn't a refrigerator in the box. If we hold it, we know something about its weight. So if it's very light, we'd say, well, it's not a bar of gold, unfortunately. If we shake it, then we can rule out it's being an open container of liquid, for example. If we let it sit on the table for a while and it doesn't start to smell bad, we can say, well, it's probably not some kind of food that is decomposing. We could smell it, we can x-ray it, we could do all kinds of things. So we sort of move progressively from just observation to how could we think about it. We could also speculate on what might be the purpose of the box on the behalf of the person who brought it in. Would that person bring in something dangerous? Could it be a treat? Again, deducing and inducing from all of the evidence that we can observe and create and document and share with each other. At some point, of course, you can reveal what it is. I often choose a teddy bear, because that answers the question of what kind of person I am. I don't bring in scary or dangerous things to the classroom. And this is a fun exercise, but critical thinking, of course, applies to all kinds of things. In fact, pretty much any question that a child would ask can be a prompt for critical thinking. If we don't know the answer, and sometimes it's better to pretend you don't know the answer, even though you might have an opinion about it, because if you just tell them the answer, of course, then nobody has to think about anything. If we don't know the answer, we have to think about how we might be able to figure that out. And of course, that's critical thinking to a T. Creativity. Here's one that I think is quite interesting. Many people think of creativity as random, off-the-wall ideas or of expressions through art, music, etc. The arts are wonderful activities to develop creativity, absolutely. But there's a particular approach to thinking and the process of creation that I teach my MBA students, but it could be used equally effectively with adolescents and probably even younger students. The point is everybody can be an inventor. And one of the nice things about this process, which is called design thinking, is that even people who think maybe that they don't have a strong feeling that they're creative. So when I was growing up, for example, my sister was very artistic and she painted and made things and was very crafty, and I wasn't sure that I was that creative. Well, I've gotten over that and am pretty sure that I'm pretty creative. But this is a process that lets everybody be creative. And it also requires collaboration. So I say that this is the 21st century twofer. So there are plenty of articles and YouTube videos, et cetera, on design thinking, but here's the basic idea. You find something that doesn't work as well as it could or should. Let's say students' backpacks. And the first step is inspiration. You watch, observe, and tell stories. So students would watch each other. They would put their backpacks on, take their backpacks off. They'll tell stories about, you know, you won't believe what happened to me when I opened my backpack yesterday. Because there are things that just happen. We all have these experiences, not necessarily with our backpacks today, but with other things. Have them think about who's using it. What are they doing? Why are they doing that? Is it easy or hard for them? How does using this backpack interact with other items like books or their lunch or their computer device? And then the second step is what's called ideation, which is when you brainstorm ideas. Brainstorming, of course, is a wonderful process to learn with a group. Members of the group can then vote on what they think the best idea is, and then they get to prototype it. Prototypes can be made out of construction paper or other handy, easily available materials. They're not necessarily truly prototyping, but you're bringing your vision and your idea to something where you can show it and explain it and sort of test out the idea and get people's reactions to it, because that's really that final step. In design thinking, what you do is prototype and test and prototype and test and prototype and test. Here you might prototype and present, and then everybody can have a lot of feedback, and sometimes people come up with some pretty funny things. You may find that someone decides to install a homing device in their backpack so they won't lose it. And of course, we can all laugh about how useful that might be. Students may come up with very different solutions, all of which make sense for a particular type of user. So this process is creative, but it's organized and can help students who think that they might not be particularly creative. Here are just some other thoughts on collaboration and creativity that can get students working together on something that requires the development of something that didn't exist before other than a 5-paragraph essay that they will really enjoy and will have many of those same benefits. Create a treasure hunt, make up a game, make up a new language, create a book of jokes, make a puzzle, cook something. I think cooking is a wonderful meeting some of those other 21st century needs, as well as thinking, processing, holding information in our minds, collaborating, all that kind of thing. Problem solving is probably my personal favorite, or certainly one of my personal favorites of the 21st century skills. And maybe it's because I come across so many problems in my life and I just feel a need to solve them. But in some ways, the activities that we've talked about already, of course, are problem solving as well. But there's a lot of value in defining something as a problem and then seeing how it can be solved. Many of you may know about the Buck Institute. If you don't, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful resource on problem-based learning, and you can get a lot of ideas there. But what I see over and over again tells me that authentic problems are the best. So not ones, and ones that the students themselves come up with, rather than you selecting a problem or somebody else selecting a problem. Something that students themselves feel are problems, or at least are curious about, are the best. So here's some examples of questions or triggers that I have seen in various situations that resulted in actual problem solving by students. Why do the buses stop where they do? Why is the lake next to our property look yellow? And I can tell you that the answer was not a good one there, but eventually did get cleaned up as a result of that student question. How should new district lines be drawn for county board members? I think there was actually a legislative district in Michigan where the students' recommendation for redrawing the district lines was the second. It wasn't chosen, but it was the number 2 out of all the proposals. So all of these kinds of things can start with just very simple questions, but that are real opportunities for problem solving with guidance and support from educators who just recognize the potential in the question. If you listen to students and their questions about the world, it's very likely that you will stumble across a problem or two that they want to explore. I know one of the things that's very different in the 21st century is the use of technology and social media in particular. I know also I hear from many parents and educators who worry about their students' use of social media. We aren't as familiar with it. Most of us are digital immigrants rather than digital natives, and so it isn't quite as intuitive for us. Sometimes we don't know what to make of it, I think. But here's an exercise that one of my colleagues used once with, actually I think she's used it several times with middle school students and has had great success with it. She started with a big question, and big questions are wonderful to get kids thinking and discussing and examining their ideas. Is social media good or bad? Students are very likely to have opinions on both sides. They can usually see both sides of the coin when they're thinking about it rationally. The problem, of course, comes when they're acting on it emotionally rather than and using those more immature parts of their brains, or not having as well-developed decision-making and rational thinking as well-developed part of those brains. So we need to get their emotions involved. And here's how my colleague Lou did this. What she did is had each student write down a negative post that someone might create about another person. Just tell them to be realistic. Write down something that some child might post about another child. And then have them read it aloud. But when they're reading it, have them substitute I and me for he or she or whatever the fictitious student's name is, and have them discuss how they feel when they read it. Usually what happens is that they're pretty amazed by how it makes them feel, that they didn't realize that they would have that kind of reaction to it, and that they certainly weren't thinking about those kinds of emotions when they were just writing it down. This is also a wonderful opportunity, as my colleague Lou did, to have them do some math in the guise of figuring out what the impact and the negative of that negative post and how wide an audience it could reach. So if the negative post just went to 3 people, let's say that person posts it and sends it to 3 people, and that person's friends then repost it again to 3 more friends, and they repost it, and so on. and let's say it takes a minute for each post, how many people would that reach in 10 minutes? What if it only takes 20 seconds or 30 seconds? What if 10 people see each post? If you do the math here, and of course students will probably try to figure this out, and probably be surprised at the result, because if it's 3 friends and it takes a minute per post, in 10 minutes it can reach 59,000 people. That is a lot of people, and you don't know. You can help students understand that they don't know that many people, but all of those strangers now can get that message about whatever that negative message about you is. So way of giving them some experience and helping them think about something that is truly part of their lives, maybe in some new ways. So let's come back to our 21st century model. We've seen how our students' ability to think and process information can be developed from cognitive training, which works on those foundational cognitive skills and core executive functions. And we looked at some approaches to stimulating the development of higher order executive functions. The key of all of this is that our brains learn. They make and strengthen neural connections by doing. Our brains become what our brains do. So giving students a chance to do and practice all of these skills is really critical for their development. Okay, I think we have tracked pretty much right on time today, so that is great. I want to now sort of open things up and see if there are some questions. Feel free to type your questions into the chat window, and Karen is going to help me sort of keep track of them. And Karen, maybe you can let me know if there are some questions that have already popped up. What are some really fun games that encourage cognitive ability? Oh, well, there are a lot of fun games. If you're talking about things that you can purchase, games like SET, S-E-T. There's a wonderful little game called Sherlock that works on cognitive skills. Various kinds of cognitive skills. There are, oh gosh, there are so many. Many, certainly chess and checkers and all those kinds of similar games put demands on those thinking skills. And of course, BrainWare Safari is one that develops them very comprehensively, and it is in the form of a video game, so kids experience it that way. The other thing is, sometimes we think that we have to come up with the games ourselves, that we have to go figure out what the right ones are. One great activity with kids is to have them make up a game. Have them make up the rules. Have them adjust the rules if they don't seem to be working. Have them discuss what's fair or what's not fair. Even developing games like to test each other on content. If there's a test coming up and they need to know some facts, have them make up a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or Jeopardy type of game. So getting the kids to do the work is actually, in many ways, more beneficial for them than us always trying to solve the game of what kinds of games that are going to be helpful for them. John is asking, I'm trying to, they're sliding by so fast. Evidence that lecturing improves brain function. I don't know of any evidence that says that lecturing improves brain function. I do know that, of course, a lot of people are very down on lecturing these days because typically, as the saying goes, if the teacher is the only one talking, then the teacher is the only one learning. We have to interact with the material in order to develop. Now, that doesn't mean that students are completely passive and not interacting with a great lecture. I tend to include some explanations. I think that our students get to points where they need to have some things explained or laid out or presented. I guess that's that's a lecture in some respects. I think it is helpful for learning. I don't know that I would use it as a particular measure of cognitive processing and whether it's going to really have an impact on that aspect of brain functioning. Do cooperative games, there was something about cooperative games. Let me see if I can find that. Cooperative games help students improve cognitive ability. They absolutely can. And particularly because cooperative games require you to think about the motivation and the intentions and the strategies of another person and how you work with that. Those can definitely be helpful. Emotions are something that does stimulate learning and memory. There was a question about this. In fact, emotions are absolutely critical to learning. We can't actually learn without them. We use our emotional system and our reward system as in the learning process. That's what enables us to learn. Other things that the question was about, what else can work as brain glue to increase retention? So I would say a couple of things. One is that it has to be meaningful and relevant. And the student has to interact with it. So there are some things that you can learn just by rote, by repeating over and over again, and it may stick with you. But for the most part, if we're learning new content or new information, we have to be able to connect it back into what we already know. We have to be able to make sense of it, and we have to interact with it. Not just one time, but then the idea of massed practice. You want to do a lot of practice closely spaced together at the beginning and then less frequently over time, and that's something that will reinforce and help with retention. There are other things that can be very helpful also in helping students remember things. Mnemonics are great, songs are great, raps and poetry are ways of helping them learn material that is otherwise doesn't have a lot of intrinsic meaning to them. So those can be very helpful. Let me see. In critical thinking after 7 by children in age in a multi-age school or program. That's an interesting question. I have mixed feelings about that, I guess. I think that if you know, if you're looking at an example like that, you know, what's in the box category or researching something or trying to investigate, I probably would do some separation. If you have high school and middle school and elementary ages, I might separate them out in those kinds of ways. But there's also a lot of value occasionally, sometimes to mixed age groups and learning how others develop, getting some insight into how other people think at different ages, helping others think in different ways. So I don't think there's a really hard and fast rule. If you really want them working hard and engaged and being a little competitive, then those same, you know, more similar age groups would probably be helpful. In terms of other kinds of activities, critical thinking, cognitive skills, and things like that, there's a website called Mind Tools that has a lot of information on things like decision making and critical thinking. I think that's a nice resource. So I would suggest that one. And then when I come across good stuff, I will often post it on our Facebook page or on our website or something like that. Sometimes you just come across things that are not part of a organized resource that are just really wonderful things. And So just a general kind of Google search is often very productive. Having kids be physically active during a learning activity. Physical activity is another really important thing that contributes to cognitive development. It increases the oxygen in our brains, which our brains need. Our brains use, I think the number is something like 10% of all of the oxygen in our bodies are used by our brains, even at rest. And so we have getting oxygen to our brains is a really good thing, and it does, in fact, help keep our brains in good physical shape and working well. There is some evidence that students who have been had some vigorous physical activity prior to learning or prior to performing on a test or something like that, that there is some advantage to that. In an after-school program, I think that it's critical to get kids to be physically active and as a complement to all the other things that they would be doing. And John is expressing his views about grouping people by age. And that's why I said I wouldn't do it by strict age, but I would say in more homogeneous groups of skill and thinking level. Okay, well, I think we are now right just up against our ending time. Again, we'll be happy to provide the slides. It looks like many of you have requested it, as well as a certificate of participation. And we'll be sending a link out so that you'll have access easily to the recorded version. Please feel free to share that with your colleagues. Here again, just to make sure everybody has it, is my contact information. We do have a couple of upcoming webinars that you might want to be cognizant of. Most of our webinars are free. We have one coming up in April on rethinking remediation in higher education. In May, we're looking at the development of the 21st century worker. So some of these same themes that we covered today will be included, but focusing a little bit more on the workplace and workforce environment. Any of you who found our little discussion of neuroscience somewhat new or somewhat interesting, you might want to consider an online interactive workshop that I have coming up on April 20th. Where I'm strictly limiting participation to 30 participants so that it can actually be interactive, much more than today. I'm going to love everybody contributing on the in the chat window, but this will be even more hands-on and interactive. And so there is a small fee for that. Plenty of information and much more workshop than presentation. Really brain basics for teachers. What are the 3 or 4 things that all teachers should understand about our brains and how they function and how they learn? So I really want to thank everybody for spending some time with us today. Really appreciate it. I hope you found it useful and helpful, and look forward to seeing you at another webinar, hopefully sometime soon. Take care and have a wonderful afternoon. Wait a second, let me turn my